Hello.
Distance learning.
We're going to talk today a little bit about shutter speed. So what is shutter speed? Who uses it? What do they use it for? How does it intersect with the ideas of depicting motion? All that good stuff. So first off, let's take a look at what shutter speed looks like on our camera. All right, here is my camera. It's marvelous. So if I look at the top of my display right here, you can see that I have a couple of my exposure variables, right? I've got my ISO, it's 800. I've got my aperture, that's 11, right? That's the size of the opening. It's kind of in the middle. And then right here, 80th, that is my shutter speed. Now it says 80, but we know if you look at the back here, that is a fraction. It is 1/80th of a second. That's important to know. We looked last week at sort of what our range is a little bit. If I go up, right, these are all still fractions, right? That's 1/1000th, right? Not 1,000 seconds. All the way up to, I max out at 8,000th of a second. Wow, that is incredibly fast. I don't know what I would use that for, but presumably something incredibly speedy and possibly daring. So let's see what my slowest one is, right? Again, we've done this before. Note as I get, whoa, what just happened there? Hey, ho, yikes. So I'll zoom in using the power of moving the camera closer. That is 1/4, right? 1/4 of a second. Now when I go one click further, it's a 0, a quotation mark, and the number 3. So what the hell is that? So those quotation marks mean seconds. So it's 0 seconds, 0.3. So this is 0.3 seconds, 0.4, 0.5, also known as a half, and 1 second. And that's going to be the same on mine on the back as on the top. This is important once you get down in the longer things like a 15th of a second. That is not a 15th of a second, that is 15 seconds, my friend. If you go and set it to this, so this is a 15-second exposure, not a 15th of a second. If you think it's 15th of a second and go to take a picture, you will be very sad because you will be sitting there for a very long time while your camera sits around doing nothing. Okay, so that is 15-second exposure. If I keep going down, the max I can do is 30. Some of you had a B setting where that means you just sort of press the shutter button and it stays taking a picture for as long as you have your finger on there. That's great. A starting point for me, it takes so long, boom. Starting point for me is an 80th of a second. Why do I like an 80th of a second? I like an 80th of a second because when I'm holding my camera, right, there's a limit to how long I can hold my camera perfectly still, right? If I'm taking a picture for 45 minutes, right, I can't, no, come on. If I'm taking a picture for 5 seconds, also no. If I'm taking a picture for 1 second, no, also no. There is a sort of threshold where I can feel pretty confident that my hand at least is going to be pretty stable. And for me, that's around an 80th of a second. It may vary for you. Maybe you're like hands of a surgeon. And you can, I have an alarm that's about to go off, so I'm going to try and stop it. You have the hands of a surgeon, and you can just hold that camera down to 1/4 of a second. Again, me, 80th of a second. Used to be a 60th of a second. Now I'm old, 80th of a second. something that can help you with that is image stabilization. So if I look here at this lens has a little slider on here that says stabilize off. Oh, it's already on off. And stabilizer on. So what that is going to do is cool things inside the lens that we don't need to talk about. They're going to keep it from the camera shake from affecting the picture as much. So with a stabilized lens, maybe you can take a picture at a slightly longer shutter speed. But again, right, we're not talking a second, we're talking maybe a 30th of a second, a 15th of a second, you know, if you're like holding really still and braced against a wall or something. So that's an important thing to know about. Now that is in the lens itself. The shutter and the range of speeds that it has are not in the lens. They are actually here inside the camera body. This is a, don't touch it, that's the shutter in this old and regrettably broken camera. So unlike aperture, where changing my lens is going to give me a different range of apertures, any camera body is going to have the same set of shutter speeds with any lens. Exceptions to the lens not making a difference are stabilization, right? Some lenses will have it and some will not. Some camera bodies also have stabilization. So if I have a Sony body, I may have stabilization in the body. The newer Canon ones also have stabilization in the body, which is great because that means that any lens that I put on it is going to be a little bit more steady at a slow shutter speed. If you're on a tripod, you should turn image stabilization off. It can get into a feedback loop and actually make your images less crisp. If you're on a tripod, not worth going into why, but that's true. What else? There's something else about. Another thing to remember about image stabilization is it prevents camera shake. It does not keep things from moving in front of the camera. Right? If I'm taking a picture of a race car and I turn on image stabilization, the race car is still going to be blurry because it's going by real fast. So image stabilization only affects camera shake, and me holding it steady does not affect blur from things in the scene. This seems obvious when I say it to you, and yet there are very many times where people are like, oh yeah, I don't know, I was on a tripod, I don't know why that race car was blurry. And I'm like, was the race car on a tripod? Because if it wasn't, it's still moving very fast. And they're like, oh yeah, like, okay. So this week we're going to be doing sort of the opposite of what we did last week. So we are going to be going in here and setting our shutter speed to a value that we want, and then adjusting our aperture and also our ISO to get the exposure that we want. So it's pretty straightforward. The one thing that we're going to run into is that there are a lot more extreme shutter speeds we can start with than there were with apertures. So let's say I have, I'm down here shooting at an 80th of a second. So I'm at 1/80th. I'm at f11 and ISO 800. So that's where I have good exposure, and I want to take my picture at an 8,000th of a second. Oh, I'm sorry, my ISO is 1250. My bad. I have a random ISO. Here, let's round it up. Let's round our ISO up to 1600. There, that's a nice number. Okay, so there we are, 80th of a second, f11, ISO 1600. That's a good exposure, but the thing I'm taking a picture of is very wiggly, very movie. I want to take a picture at an 8,000th of a second, right? I want to keep the same exposure, but do it with a much faster shutter speed. So we'll talk more about equivalent exposures next week. The thing we want to do right now is just count the clicks. right? So right now I'm making my shutter speed faster, right? That's going to make my exposure darker unless I change other stuff. So making my exposure faster, I'm going to count how many clicks I'm doing that. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Damn it, lost count. Try it again. That's why I wrote it down to begin with. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Wow, that's 20 clicks. So I have 20 clicks of making my shutter speed faster, which, if I don't change anything else, will make my exposure a lot darker. To get the same exposure, right, I need to go same total number of clicks and in the other direction, right, in the making things brighter direction. With my aperture, right, that means making it a larger opening. Larger opening, remember, is a smaller number. So let's go ahead. I can go down, down on the aperture. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Up 12, that's as far as I can go. So that is, I've got 12, all right, but I still have to go 8 more. So if I'm bottoming out my aperture, right, the maximum aperture I can get on this lens is 2.8. That means the only thing left to adjust is my ISO. So let's go ahead and adjust my ISO, and I'll go up. So remember, up on my ISO means more sensitive, brighter, right? That's what we're trying to do. We made a very fast shutter speed that made everything darker, so we're adjusting our other two variables to make things brighter again. So adjust my ISO toward the bright side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yep, 6. That's as many as I can get, right? The highest ISO I can get is ISO 6400. So that was 6 clicks, right? I had 12 I needed to go. That means I still have 6 left. Now, this means basically that I wasn't able to adjust my other two variables enough, right, to compensate for how fast that 8,000th of a second was. Right, that 8,000th of a second was such an incredibly fast exposure. Right, it let light in for a very brief period of time. Everything got really, really dark. So I needed to open that aperture up as much as I could, right? And I needed to make my ISO higher so that I was more sensitive to the light that got in, so I could have a good exposure. And I did that, right? I opened up my aperture as much as I could, right? Lens only went to 2.8. It was still really dark. So I was like, okay, well, that's one variable. The other variable is my ISO. So I boosted my ISO up as high as I could get. That was 6400. And, right, it was too dark. I still had many more jumps, 6 to go. I just did all of that without myself being on camera. So what happened there, right? So it was like, okay, I want to make my shutter speed this very, very fast shutter speed, right? When I do that, right, I can go really, really fast, really very fast. When I do that, that means I'm letting light in for a very, very brief period of time, and I haven't changed any other things. It makes my exposure a lot darker. If I want to keep the same exposure, right, I need to adjust my other two variables, aperture and ISO. So I open my aperture as big as I can, right? Open it up all the way, right? That lens goes to 2.8, so I'm all the way there at 2.8. Pretty big aperture. Some of us only have 3.5 to 5.6. Some of us have something that goes down to 1.8, 1.4. But it's 2.8. That's pretty good. But right, it was letting in more light, but it still wasn't enough to compensate for how fast that 8,000th of a second was. So I was like, okay, well, I got to increase my ISO, so I'm more sensitive to that light that does get in, so I can make a picture. Did that, right? But I couldn't increase my ISO high enough to be able to compensate for it. So because our shutter speed goes so fast, all the way to an 8,000th, so slow, all the way down to 30 seconds, at the extremes of those ranges, it will often be impossible to get a good exposure. If I walk into a dark room and try and take a picture at an 8,000th of a second, highly unlikely. If I try to go out into the noonday sun and take a picture for 30 seconds, highly unlikely. One is almost inevitably going to be underexposed. One is almost inevitably going to be overexposed. So A, you're going to have to be adjusting your ISO more this week. And B, you're going to need to be paying more attention to the lighting. If you want to shoot with a really fast shutter speed, try to go somewhere where there's a decent amount of light. If you want to shoot with a very long shutter speed, try to go somewhere where it is not too bright. It'll take some experimentation to figure out where those limits are, how to translate what we see with our eyes into what our camera can see. But it's an important step toward understanding the limits of what we can do with a camera. All right, so now we'll go ahead and take a look in the next clip at what the aesthetic differences are between a fast shutter speed and a slow shutter speed.